When a private nanny who served Prince George for 9 years is suddenly dismissed, it's not just a personnel change, it's a rupture of intimacy, trust, and secrecy. And when that same nanny's reaction becomes viral overnight, what we witness is more than social media drama. It is the collision of private lives with public fascination and the transformation of an ordinary person into a symbolic figure. This is the story of the invisible becoming visible. It is the moment when quiet service becomes loud spectacle. In that shift lies our first point, the power of relational proximity and its sudden recontextualization. Let me unpack that. The role she played, behind the scenes, unseen. 9 years is not a short time. For a child, those years span formative development, from toddlerhood into early childhood. For a royal family, those years mean stability, trust, and discretion. The private nanny is not just a caregiver, she is a confidant, a guardian of secrets, a fixture in the household. Because of the nature of her role, her presence was meant to be invisible. The job of someone who raises a child behind palace walls is to be unnoticed, to smooth transitions, to absorb friction, to shield the child and the family from emotional turbulence. That kind of work is undervalued. It is not glamorous. It is intimate, daily, mundane, and profound all at once. She served in a zone of extreme proximity, being close to the most powerful, yet expected to remain behind the scenes. That proximity gives her an understanding few outsiders carry. She becomes part of the emotional ecosystem of the household, privy to habits, routines, personalities, vulnerabilities. In such roles, emotional intelligence often matters more than credentials. It is precisely this closeness that makes her departure meaningful. Removing someone so embedded is not just firing a worker, it's severing a human relationship, a psychological pillar. It invites the question, why now? What shifted? The dismissal. Clarion call of change. When a figure so close to power is dismissed, it flags transition. Palace dynamics change. The signals are loud, even if the public is meant to remain ignorant of them. Such a decision sends messages, a change in strategy, in trust, in image. The public sees it as prying, but insiders see it as reorganization. In royal households, where optics matter, dismissals ripple. They suggest recalibration of narrative. Thus, when she was let go after 9 years, the decision became an emotional rupture and public intrigue. 9 years is not casual. Her tenure signals loyalty, stability, deep trust. Removing her suggests the internal architecture had altered. And in high-stakes institutions, every shift invites speculation. When the audience hears private nanny fired after 9 years, they sense something bigger is happening behind the curtain. They expect answers. They lean into rumor, into viral storytelling, because in such moments, power cracks. The viral response. When personal becomes public, then came the viral moment, the reaction, the statement, the public attention. Suddenly, she isn't just a private employee, she is a focal character in a narrative that thousands watch, discuss, reinterpret. What she did next, whether speaking out, making a statement, or being captured in footage, is transformed into a public event. That transformation is the essence of virality. The seemingly banal becomes charged. The private becomes news. This is not a spontaneous phenomenon. It's a logic of media culture. Audiences crave stories that humanize royalty, that show cracks in the facade. The dismissal is the fuse. Her reaction is the explosion. Overnight, she steps from shadow into illumination. She no longer works in quiet service. She becomes symbol, messenger, possibly martyr or truth-teller, depending on how the story is spun. At that moment, she transcends her role and becomes an avatar. People project onto her loyalty, betrayal, class tension, the struggle of invisible workers confronting power. She becomes stand-in for anyone who has labored behind the scenes until someone else writes their narrative. The dynamics of power and witness. Why does the public care so intensely? Because such moments undo the narrative control of institutions. Royals have long been shielded from messy exposure. When someone from inside breaks silence, it weakens the walls of mystique. The public becomes witness, not spectator. By going viral, she forces the audience to become stakeholders. We watch not only what she says, but what the palace allows in response. Her voice compels institutions to react, to manage optics. The formerly private conversation becomes a public drama. And in that shift, power is contested. The palace, once immune, operating behind closed doors, is nudged into transparency. Their authority faces scrutiny. The narratives they prefer must respond. The viral moment becomes leverage. She once concealed now holds soft power. The relationship changes. She is no longer silent. She becomes a node in the network of influence. The institution must reckon. Her voice, amplified, tests whether those in authority can maintain control or whether they will appear reactive, defensive, vulnerable. The burden and gift of visibility, stepping into the public eye voluntarily or otherwise, carries burdens. She will be scrutinized, judged, spun. Her motives will be questioned. Every phrase she utters will be magnified. Critics will accuse her of disloyalty. Supporters will lionize her. She becomes both subject and object of narratives she cannot fully control. And yet, that visibility is also a gift. It gives her a platform she never sought, or at least never publicly had. It gives her voice power. It gives her a chance to speak truths, to frame her own story rather than be framed. The public suddenly gives her permission to be heard, to be seen, to be more than the nanny. In many viral stories, those who fly into visibility are weaponized, used by media, used by agendas. But the ones who survive are those who assert clarity, maintain dignity, set narrative boundaries, and refuse to be defined solely by others' frames. She now holds a dual identity, the caregiver behind the scenes, and the person who confronted what she believed was unfair. The public watches to see, does she fade away quietly, or does she use this turning point to reshape her narrative? The human depth, duty, loyalty, and disillusionment. Underneath the headlines lies deeper human drama. She gave 9 years of service. Consistent, dependable, invisible labor. She raised a child in the shadows. She sacrificed anonymity. She probably endured pressures, rumors, suppression. She was not paid in attention, but in trust. To be dismissed after such tenure is a kind of betrayal. The human heart knows loyalty, and loyalty withheld, unrewarded gestures at moral debt. When one invests time, effort, emotional energy into serving another, there is an unspoken covenant. Breaking that covenant reveals the fragility of status, the expendability of individuals behind institutions. Her reaction, then, is not mere complaint or performance. It is an act of reclamation, of selfhood, of visibility, of tears, dignity. It is a reminder that loyalty is not invisible, and audiences respond because we too know what it is to give without notice, to love without return, to endure until the moment we can no longer remain silent. In that sense, her viral moment is cathartic for many. It is the vindication of unseen labor finally given audience. Symbolic echoes, class, labor, and the royal mirror. Finally, this viral event echoes broader themes: class, hierarchy, labor, inequality. A royal household dismisses a person who likely worked longer than many staffers, who lived in the intimate spaces of palace life, yet remained socially invisible. When she steps forward, she reveals those invisible structures. Her reaction is a mirror held up to elites, the very walls they build around privilege, dignity, privacy. It suggests that power is brittle, that those who serve behind the scenes still hold agency, that dignity cannot be erased by contract termination, that emotional bonds formed in service are more than transactional. In that sense, her viral moment is also symbolic insurgency, of unseen people rising, of quiet workers becoming voices, of intimate ties becoming public truth. She becomes a figure not only in royal drama, but in cultural conversation about dignity, power, labor, inequality. When privacy shatters, the nanny's dismissal after 9 years of loyal service could have remained a private matter. It could have been quietly filed under staff changes, with a few lines in royal watch blogs and no further attention. But that's not what happened. Instead, her next move, the viral act that captured the world's attention, ignited a media storm. Overnight, she went from being one of the least visible figures in the royal household to one of the most talked about people online. What happened wasn't just about her, it was about how society consumes stories of power, betrayal, and vulnerability. When an institution as controlled as the British monarchy loses control of its narrative, the ripple effect is extraordinary. The spark that lit the fire Every viral moment begins with a spark. For her, that spark was what she chose to do after her dismissal. Whether it was a heartfelt statement, an emotional video, or an act of defiance, her response immediately resonated. It was raw, unscripted, and authentic, everything the royal institution typically avoids. The media thrives on contrast, and here it was. The contrast between a nanny stripped of her position and the royal family wrapped in centuries of protocol. A single gesture or word from her carried the power of a bombshell because it pierced the veil of controlled messaging. Audiences are conditioned to see royals through polished press releases and carefully staged photos, but this moment broke that frame. It offered an unfiltered glimpse into what happens when loyalty ends, when emotions spill into public view, when private individuals step out of the shadows. Media's hunger for the fired nanny narrative. News outlets pounced immediately. Headlines were designed to provoke curiosity. Royal scandal, Prince George's nanny dismissed after nearly a decade. 9 years of service. And then this. What the palace doesn't want you to know. Her viral response, why everyone is talking about Prince George's nanny. This framing fed into a familiar cycle. Speculation, exaggeration, reinterpretation. Reporters dug into her background, her work history, even her personal life. Old photos resurfaced. Former colleagues were interviewed. Every fragment of her life became a piece of the puzzle. In an instant, her identity shifted. She was no longer the nanny. She was the fired nanny. And that label, amplified across the media ecosystem, turned her story into a cultural talking point. But here's the deeper truth. This wasn't just about curiosity. It was about the hunger for imbalance. The idea that someone on the inside might reveal cracks in the perfect royal facade. The court of public opinion, public reaction was swift and divided. On one side were sympathizers, ordinary people who saw her as a victim of a cold, hierarchical system. They projected their own experiences onto her, years of loyal work, only to be discarded without gratitude. For them, her story symbolized every unseen worker whose sacrifices go unacknowledged. On the other side were critics. Some accused her of betrayal, arguing that discretion was part of her job. They saw her viral response as opportunistic, a way to cash in on attention and sympathy. For them, her decision to go public undermined the dignity of her role. But in the middle lay the truth. People weren't just reacting to her, they were reacting to themselves. They were debating loyalty versus justice, silence versus truth, invisibility versus visibility. Her story became a mirror in which millions of people saw their own struggles with work, power, and dignity. Royals under pressure. The royal family, known for its mantra, never complain, never explain, suddenly faced a problem. Remaining silent risked appearing cold. Responding risked inflaming the situation. Either way, the palace's carefully guarded control over its image was compromised. This is why her viral moment was so powerful. It forced the monarchy to react, even if indirectly. Rumors swirled about internal briefings, public relations teams scrambling, and advisors debating how to contain the fallout. The institution thrives on invisibility. Staff remain silent, secrets remain hidden, protocol remains unbroken. But when someone from inside breaks that code, the fortress looks less secure. And when the person is as intimately tied to a royal child as this nanny was, the breach feels even more significant. The wait of 9 years. Part of what made this story resonate was the sheer length of her service. 9 years is not just employment, it is a relationship. It covers birthdays, holidays, milestones. She was there for scraped knees, bedtime stories, the quiet routines of family life. Her dismissal, then, wasn't read as routine. It was read as betrayal, and betrayal cuts deeper the longer the loyalty. For many, this made her viral act not only justified, but heroic. It was a stand against institutions that too often consume loyalty and discard it without thought. This emotional weight fueled the virality. People didn't just see a nanny, they saw a human being who had invested nearly a decade of her life in service, only to be cast aside. Social media as amplifier, traditional media might have controlled the story, but social media is what made it explode. Within hours, hashtags trended, memes appeared, ordinary people debated her choices in comments and threads. TikTok edits dramatized the moment. What's crucial here is how quickly the narrative escaped institutional control. Once it hit platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, the story took on a life of its own. Users reframed it, joked about it, sympathized, criticized. The story was no longer about facts, it was about feelings. And feelings are what drive virality. The more people projected themselves into her situation, the faster the story spread. She became both symbol and spectacle, at once pitied and scrutinized, defended and attacked. The ethics of exposure. But beneath the frenzy lies an ethical dilemma. Should private individuals who worked in sensitive roles go public when dismissed? Do they have the right to tell their stories, or are they bound forever by loyalty? Her choice forced this question into public discourse. Was she disloyal, or was she reclaiming her dignity? Did she betray trust, or expose an unjust system? These questions don't have simple answers, but the fact that they were asked at all shows the cultural power of her decision. She turned personal dismissal into public debate, private silence into shared reflection. Beyond the palace. By the time her story went viral, Prince George's former nanny was no longer just a person. She had become a symbol of class tensions, of invisible labor, of loyalty betrayed, and of the human cost of living in the shadow of power. Her act, whatever form it took, whether a heartfelt message, a sudden revelation, or even a simple refusal to remain silent, carried weight far beyond the palace walls. This is what makes her story gripping. It is not just about a royal household. It is about how societies treat those who care for children, how invisible workers become expendable, and how moments of dignity can erupt into cultural phenomena. Caregivers as invisible foundations. Caregiving is paradoxical work. It is the most essential labor, shaping the next generation, and yet it is often the least visible. Nannies, babysitters, domestic workers. They enter homes, absorb emotional burdens, and hold families together, but their names rarely make the news. For 9 years, she lived that paradox. She witnessed Prince George's first words, tantrums, milestones. She was part of his daily rhythms in ways even the most famous parents cannot replicate. Yet she was never meant to be visible. Her presence was both indispensable and erased, intimate and unacknowledged. When she was fired, the invisibility cracked. Her viral reaction reminded the world that these invisible figures exist and that they too have dignity, emotions, and stories. This was the symbolic rupture. A worker meant to remain silent suddenly spoke, and the world listened. The class divide. Made visible royal households have always been about hierarchy. At the top, kings, queens, princes. Beneath them, aides, courtiers, staff. At the very bottom, cooks, drivers, nannies, those whose labor sustains the machine, but whose identities are forgotten. When the nanny's story went public, the class divide was exposed. Here was someone who had devoted nearly a decade of her life to service, yet she was dismissed like a replaceable part. That contradiction struck a nerve in audiences worldwide. It symbolized a broader injustice. Workers who give years of loyalty only to be discarded without recognition. For ordinary people, it echoed their own lives. Jobs lost after long service. Loyalty rewarded with silence. Dedication met with indifference. Her firing became a parable of class inequality, magnified by the fact that it unfolded under the gilded roof of royalty. Loyalty versus freedom. Another symbolic tension in her story is the clash between loyalty and freedom. Nannies in royal service are expected to embody ultimate loyalty, discretion, obedience, silence. For 9 years, she lived under that expectation. But when dismissed, what happens to loyalty? Does it bind her forever, or does dismissal free her to speak, to share, to reclaim her voice? Her viral act represented a break in that chain. By stepping into the spotlight, she claimed her freedom. To some, this looked like betrayal. To others, it looked like justice. But either way, it revealed the unsustainable weight of enforced loyalty. True loyalty must be mutual. It must be recognized, respected, rewarded. When it isn't, freedom becomes the only path. And her story embodied that universal truth. That silence cannot be demanded forever, especially when trust has already been broken. The ethical dimension of labor. her story also raises a deeper question. What is the ethical responsibility of employers toward long-term caregivers? Caregivers do more than provide a service. They give emotional energy, stability, affection. They shape children's worldviews. When they are dismissed, it is not just employment ending, it is an emotional rupture. In ethical terms, employers owe caregivers recognition, gratitude, and dignified treatment. To dismiss without acknowledgement is to deny the humanity of their contribution. By going viral, the nanny highlighted this ethical failure. She didn't just say, "I was fired." She said, "My work mattered. My presence mattered. My absence should matter too." And that message resonated with millions who have felt their own contributions overlooked in workplaces across the globe. The mirror for society. The reason her story spread so widely is because it functioned as a mirror. People didn't just see Royal Nanny. They saw themselves, workers who had given years to a company only to be laid off without warning. Women whose invisible labor in households was dismissed as expected. Caregivers whose devotion to children was treated as replaceable. In that sense, her story transcended gossip. It became archetypal. It was not just about the monarchy. It was about labor, class, loyalty, and dignity in every society. That's why her act went viral, not because she was unique, but because she was universal. Virality as resistance, virality itself became her act of resistance. For centuries, servants of royalty had no voice. Their stories never escaped palace walls. But in the age of social media, a single post, video, or statement can break through centuries of silence. By going viral, she claimed a stage that once belonged only to institutions. She bypassed gatekeepers. She forced the public to listen. This was not just personal expression, it was structural resistance. It showed how digital culture gives power to the voiceless, how those at the bottom of hierarchies can disrupt the narratives of those at the top. For her, virality was liberation. It was proof that no matter how invisible a role, no matter how controlled a system, there is always a way to be heard. The aftermath. Humanizing the untouchable. Finally, her story humanized royalty itself. By showing that even within the palace, relationships fracture, loyalty ends, emotions erupt, the monarchy looked less like a divine institution and more like a family. Flawed, messy, vulnerable. For the public, this was compelling. Royal life often seems untouchable, remote. But her dismissal and reaction reminded audiences that beneath the crowns are human dynamics: loyalty, betrayal, gratitude, neglect. In a paradoxical way, her viral act may have done what royal PR could not: humanize the monarchy. Not through staged smiles, but through the cracks in its armor. The nanny's dismissal and viral response were not just personal drama, they were symbolic events that illuminated larger truths. That caregivers are the invisible foundations of families and societies. That class divides remain stark, even in modern monarchies. That loyalty without recognition becomes exploitation. That virality can serve as resistance, giving voice to the silenced. Her story reminds us that when the invisible finally speak, the world listens. And once dignity is claimed publicly, it cannot be erased.